Hello and welcome to the Offensive Security Podcast. I'm Dr. Heather Monthi, and today I am here with Lester Godsey, CISO of Maricopa County, Arizona in the United States. It's the fourth most populated and fastest growing county in the United States. For those of you who might be international, Arizona is in the southwestern portion of the United States, and he's also the former CISO in the city of Mesa, Arizona as well. Lester has over 26 years of experience in IT and security at the local government level. He's also taught at the collegiate level for over 12 years in areas such as technology, business, project management, and cybersecurity. And he was also selected as Government Technology's 2021 Top 25 Doers, Dreamers, and Drivers. He was also recently presented just last week at the RSA conference on social media and organizational risk. Speaking from his globally publicized experience with the 2020 presidential election and highly contested integrity of this election, Lester has also been advocating for organizations to develop strategies to mitigate the negative consequences that come from misinformation and disinformation spread on social media. So welcome, Lester.
Thank you for having me, Heather.
So tell us a little bit about your background and just how you do security.
Yeah, so I'm sure you remember the whole, I think it was Equifax or Experian situation. So when I give my background, I'm always a little hesitant because, so actually my undergrad is in music. Mm-hmm. So at one point in my life, I had aspired to be a band teacher. And so, so it turns out I started doing my student teaching observation and realized I didn't really care for kids. So, I kind of had to make a quick turnabout in terms of career and direction. I tried computer science for a semester, failed all my classes. I wish I was exaggerating, by the way, Heather. And then I decided just to get my general BA in music because I needed to graduate with something. And so then I tried technology a second time. So I entered into a master's program and eventually received my MS in technology. So that's kind of my roundabout way getting into IT in general. And then from a cybersecurity perspective, early on in my career, I worked for relatively small organizations where you had to wear multiple hats. And so security always wound up being one of them. It wasn't necessarily my full-time gig, if you will, but then I eventually transitioned at the city of Mesa where the opportunity presented itself, and I was able to get onboarded as their CISO for the organization. And I've currently been with Maricopa County almost 3 years now as the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer.
That's great. I think that you're another really good example of somebody who got a degree in something else completely unrelated to security and was still able to break into security. I think especially, some of us that might be a little bit older, there weren't always degrees in cybersecurity. Back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, there weren't college degrees in cybersecurity. So you had to get a different route to get there. And, me personally, my undergrad's in computer science, but I've spoken to so many people that they have degrees in band and other areas that are just completely unrelated. So I think it's a good example for our listeners who might be wanting to get into cybersecurity and don't have that degree and are wondering, do they need to go back to get a different degree, or can they do certifications? Can they do other kinds of training? But also for people who are hiring, especially entry-level cybersecurity analysts, that they don't always have a degree in cybersecurity. It could be something like band.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so I think it's a great example. So I always like to talk, when I talk to new people on the podcast, I like to ask them to tell us just something a little bit about themselves. It's like not tech or cyber related at all. We've talked in the past episodes, we've talked about aviation, we've talked about martial arts, we've talked about all sorts of different stuff. So tell us a little bit about you that might be completely unrelated.
Yeah, so that one's relatively easy. So me personally, my background, I'm half Japanese, specifically Okinawan. So that only matters to Japanese or Okinawan people. And the reason why I say that is because Okinawa, from a historical perspective, was its own kingdom, and it was fought over by Japan and China for many years until eventually Japan claimed quote unquote ownership. And so so speaking of age, I'm gonna age myself, but my family name is Miyagi, just like out of the movies.
Yes.
And I had an uncle who is something like a fifth or sixth degree black belt in Uechi-do, which is one of the Okinawan style of karates. So I come from the Miyagi clan, if you will.
Oh,
So
that's really cool.
little tidbit about myself. And oh, by the way, I should have started by saying I don't know a lick of martial arts, by the way. So yeah.
All right. Well, that's fair. It does seem like there a lot of people that I've talked to is through the podcast and through other areas. And I like to ask this question. And it seems like martial arts comes up a lot with this group of people.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. And my tie to martial arts is I wanted to do judo when I was a kid, but my mom only let me do one thing at a time, which I now know it's because she didn't want to drive me all over the place all the time. But I wanted to do judo, and she's like, well, you have to pick between this, or I think I played the cello at the time or something like that. And she said, nope, you got to pick. So anyways, all right. So let's talk a little bit about your experience as a CISO. So can you just tell us a little bit, about Maricopa County, how it's structured and how your team supports the other areas of Maricopa County?
Yeah, Maricopa County, and again, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, by population, it's the fourth largest in the U.S. And so from a user base, we have just a smidge under 14,000 users. There's 56 different departments within Maricopa County. And of those, there are 8 elected departments. And so the reason why I mention that is because from an ordinance perspective, these 8 departments really function unto themselves. They have a certain amount of autonomy within the organization, so much so that those departments are ran by elected officials, if you will. And so they're kind of on a, for lack of a better description, equal level, I should say, to the Board of Supervisors. So and so that poses an interesting challenge from an information security perspective. That coupled with the fact that a large number of these elected departments in particular, but even some of the non-elected departments have their own IT. So IT is decentralized at Maricopa County, which makes the concept of information security governance a challenging one. And so, so it's not like I have an actual stick that I can use, so to speak, to enforce governance. Mm-hmm. The closest thing I have is from an ordinance perspective is that if there's an active security event underway, I have the ability to go in from a network perspective to, disconnect networks, down nodes, things of that sort. But when it comes to adoption of security control services, adoption and standardization of a framework, et cetera, I don't really have the ability to dictate to a department. And so, and this I think will tie into our conversation a little bit later, but that's probably one of my biggest challenges as well too, because as in my role as the enterprise CISO, my objective is to ensure that we have a uniform approach to cybersecurity such that we have minimally acceptable levels of security controls and standards in place to protect the entire enterprise.
Okay. So given that, now I want to talk a little bit about critical infrastructure. And the reason for that is because I think that when people are, they're interested in cybersecurity or they're talking about cybersecurity, a lot of times we think about enterprise security and network security and how do we protect email and how do we protect the network and how do we protect databases and things like that. And then then there's the flip side of it that we have a lot of people that are interested in penetration testing and ethical hacking and that kind of thing. But there's this whole area of critical infrastructure and how do we protect critical infrastructure and how do we find people with the skills to protect critical infrastructure and things like that. So given your role and some of your experiences with Maricopa County, what kinds of things have you either been a part of or things that you've seen that how we're supporting security and critical infrastructure, but then also how are we finding the people that know that these technologies to be able to support like power plants and water supply and things like that?
Yeah, and so great question. And one thing I would encourage your listeners to consider is, and I've come to recently appreciate this given my recent involvement with the board of Arizona InfraGard, whose focus is on that public-private partnership and building those relationships with a specific goal in supporting the 16 critical infrastructure areas as defined by the federal government, right? And so I suspect a lot of your listeners actually work for organizations, whether they realize it or not, that are important to that critical infrastructure. And so it really kind of goes back to the whole, I guess, recent spotlight on supply chain, if you will. And so in a lot of instances, obviously, Maricopa County has either direct or indirect involvement in things like Palo Verde nuclear power plant as it relates to emergency planning at a regional level, but also indirectly with regards to transportation or water infrastructure or things of that sort. But that also applies to commercial facilities. That also applies to, the health services, et cetera, et cetera. So I suspect lots of people work for organizations that either directly or indirectly support critical infrastructure. But now, with that being said, it is an interesting topic, especially in those areas. So not so much in my current position, but my previous one. There's this whole dichotomy, and I've spoken to this, and I'm sure you have experience, Heather, with regards to OT versus IT and what that challenge is, right? And at a high level, I guess I would say it's interesting in that as security practitioners, when we try to support critical infrastructure of that nature, that's more operational technology driven, we can't 100% apply our IT experience to that and be successful. And a great example of that was at my previous gig. I speak like a musician still, even though I'm not one anymore. But at my previous gig, there's a lot of sensitivity around SCADA networks. And so, the things that you and I would do without, blinking an eye on doing like vulnerability scans, that may have a detrimental impact on SCADA networks. And so we have to work with the OT experts to develop a compromise to ensure that we're still scanning, but doing so in a way that doesn't materially impact the performance of that network, if you will. And so IT people, unfortunately, that's one of those things. Until you start experiencing that and gaining experience along those lines, there's kind of there's a fine art to it to a certain degree. But it is interesting in that it is kind of a niche skill, but it's one that can be developed as long as you are open-minded about understanding from a business impact perspective what those challenges are and what those things are that might be unique with those critical infrastructure areas. Because while everything's becoming more interconnected, cloud services, et cetera, that's the other thing from an OT perspective. I think people in the OT field need to realize that things are changing in their landscape as well, and they need to coordinate more with the traditional IT folks. But it is a challenge, but it is something that you can definitely gain experience along those lines and get exposed to.
Sure. So you mentioned supply chain security, and you mentioned cloud, and you mentioned a couple of different things here, but what do you see as probably one of the biggest risks right now around critical infrastructure?
And as much as it pains me to say this, because I've said this for years now, and I still think it's probably our number one issue, it's just honestly some of the basics when it comes to cybersecurity, just awareness. So a great example of that is, do we fully understand what's in our environments, whether it's from an IT or OT perspective, whether it involves critical infrastructure or not? The way that technology is changing, especially with the proliferation of IoT devices, is such that these IoT technologies are really, they come in and out of our environment at will almost. And so having a good, accurate understanding of what's in our environment at any given point is a huge challenge. And that kind of technology tends to find its way into critical infrastructure. So whether it's from a manufacturing perspective, whether it's from a SCADA network perspective or communications, whatever the case is. So I think we've already had that challenge to begin with in terms of, especially because there tends to be in some instances, older technology involved from a critical infrastructure perspective. So are you really aware of what's in the environment in the first place? And then with the move of cloud and IoT, all what I'm seeing is all that's doing is making it that much more difficult to track and have awareness of what's in the environment. So then you can do the basics of vulnerability scanning, asset management, which then in turn informs and helps you identify what the risk is to the organization at any given point. So I think those things that we were having problems with years ago aren't getting easier, they're getting more challenging as a result of accelerated adoption of cloud and IoT technology.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like critical infrastructure security is something, I mean, you could do a whole podcast series on that, right? So yeah. I'm glad to just, chat about it a little bit. I think another thing that we could probably do a whole podcast series about is the topic of election integrity. And I want to bring it up. I want to talk about it. I know I listened to you speak on this before. And you said that, this was your first election that you were in a role as a CISO. And for our listeners who are not aware, Maricopa County was in the hot seat in the 2020 presidential election here in the United States. We won't go into the details of it. You can certainly get online and take a look and see what was happening. But the election integrity was something that was being very much talked about globally as a result of some of the things that we saw in Maricopa County. And just as a reminder, when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about three things here. We're talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so when if things like election integrity come into play, that's where security comes in, right? So obviously only you're talking about things that you're able to talk about, but could you just tell us a little bit about some of the lessons that you learned? And again, you've mentioned, I've heard you speak about this before, and you've mentioned that this was your first election and you didn't really have anything to compare it to, but what are some of the things that you feel like that might have been a unique experience for you that you might be able to share with other CISOs of other local governments on election integrity?
Yeah, great question. And so, as you mentioned, it was my first election, and I think I've been recorded saying something to the effect that the closest experience I've had prior to the election of that magnitude and impact was probably when I've been involved in emergency operations centers being stood up. I mean, it was that intense and severe, I guess, for lack of a better description. But to get to it, from a 2020 election cycle, as it relates to cybersecurity and TTPs, or the kind of things that you and I face as security practitioners. Number one, we saw virtually every single type of attack. So we saw DDoS, we saw data scraping, we saw vendor supply chain, we saw nation state attacks, we saw APT groups, hacktivists, et cetera, and everything in between. I mean, literally, I wish I was exaggerating. And so, but some of the takeaways, one of the things that really we learned as an organization was just the sheer impact on that social media had on the organization. You had mentioned earlier in the podcast mis and disinformation, and for your listeners who don't know the difference, it really fundamentally comes down to intent, right? So misinformation is where you're unknowingly sharing incorrect information, and again, it happens, and it's not obviously limited to social media, but we see a propensity of that on social media. But disinformation is obviously of greater concern to any organization, Maricopa County included, because that's an instance where somebody is willfully and intentionally sharing bad information, typically for nefarious purposes. And so we saw just a ton of that. And there's just so many examples of that we experienced and we continue to see even today as an organization. And so the TLDR to that, Heather, is we were able, through our experience, we can say that increased negative sentiment on social media is not only an indicator of increased cyber risk to the organization, but we honestly found it to be a greater indication of risk from a physical or kinetic risk perspective. And so there were multiple instances, and I'll just give one example. And so a couple of months after the 2020 election itself, there was somebody who was hanging outside of our recorder's building, and the recorder's office is the one responsible for elections at the county level. And so they were observing somebody loading up a van, or a truck, I should say, outside the recorder's building. And so they started sharing that on social media, and they were quickly encouraged to let's start live streaming, right? And so they were basically making the insinuation that the truck was being loaded with some voting equipment, and we're trying to get rid of it. And next thing you know, that individual is not only live streaming it, but they're following the truck. It just so happens that it wasn't voting equipment; it was an old multifunction device that was going to get salvaged, and the person they were following was the sheriff's deputy. And so that could have easily turned into a situation that became kinetic or physical, right? If the wrong thing had happened. And so that's the kind of stuff that we experience all the time. But between that and the various different threats that the organization has received, social media has really become not only a threat vector, but a source of intelligence, something that my SOC team has had to dive into in order to gain better awareness on what the potential risk to Maricopa County is at any given moment. So,
right. So, so as a result of some of these experiences that you've had, you've been a little bit more outspoken about, misinformation and disinformation, and that organizations need to be doing something about this and mitigating these negative consequences. If somebody's following around a sheriff's deputy, something needs to be done here. So, what kinds of things are you talking to organizations about and presenting about that? Okay, this is happening. So what are some of your thoughts on what we need to do about it?
Yeah, and so the first thing is, from my perspective, the 2020 election is an extreme example. But so one of the first things I try to encourage people to do is be cognizant of the fact that this is not a government-only type of problem. Granted, the government sector in general has quite a bit of this, but I posit that any organization that cares about brand, reputation, or even as fundamental as the bottom line, social media has the potential of impacting that. And so I've seen stories, or I've seen studies that show that, like, for example, companies that are pre-IPO, for example, they could have their valuation impacted as a result of poor social media coverage or sentiment, if you will. But most organizations, and obviously government, we put a premium, on trust. And so unfortunately, Pew Research had recently done a study that showed that trust in the government is at an all-time low. And so it's hard to deliver service, and it's hard to partner with our constituents, the residents in the business community, if we don't have that trust. I would argue that private sector is no different, maybe different impact, but anybody who cares about trust, reputation, brand, those sorts of things need to spend more time in social media. And from a cybersecurity perspective, if part of our bread and butter is understanding what the risk is to the organization at any given moment, we can't afford to continue to ignore social media, because that's a source of that risk, but it's also a source of insight as to what that risk is.
Yeah, and I think, as you're saying some of these things, I've learned over the years a lot of things about internet marketing and, just how you promote your business online, right? And I think a lot of the things you're saying are, kind of go along both lines there. Like, you need to be using social media in a positive way to put out your brand and your reputation and that kind of thing. But you also need to be monitoring what's being said about your organization, about your brand, about the people that work for you, that kind of thing. So I think that's an interesting take. And I just kind of had that connection.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because, some of the tools that we use to monitor social media aren't designed for cybersecurity. It's actually for that marketing and communications. And so some of the tools we use, and I won't mention them, but measure brand sentiment. And so it'll give us negative, neutral, and positive social media brand sentiment. And then we report that to the organization. And we use that as a basis to start digging into, okay, what are we going to try to research along those lines? So it's funny you mention that, but yeah, that's exactly
Okay,
we're
yeah,
doing that,
that's
and
pretty cool.
yeah, so
I just put that connection together in my head of like, you could be using some of these same tools that you're using for marketing and brand awareness and social media, and that you can be using it for security. I was even talking to somebody about Snapchat and about how you can use the hotspots. I think they're the hotspots or snap maps, something like that. And you can get good intelligence just by watching some of those in different parts of the world, some of those videos. So let's switch gears just a little bit. So we've talked about a lot of different things in a short amount of time. We talked about critical infrastructure, election integrity, social media security. You've also got some experience teaching at the collegiate level. So given all of your experiences here, what are some of the skills that you see that CISOs and other security leaders that they need to either hire or train for in cybersecurity staff in the future? Just where do you see things are going, and what kind of skills do CISOs and security leaders need to be hiring and or training for?
yeah, so, and this maybe is cliche, but I can impress enough upon your listeners that effective communication skills, so the soft skills in particular, I think are really challenging. And so a great example of this is one of the areas of focus within Maricopa County, our information security program, is that of our assurance team. And so we have a pretty good approach when it comes to incident response. My team is pretty mature along those lines, but what we're trying to do is develop some proactive services in the form of being able to conduct risk analysis and things of that sort, and being able to speak in terms that the business understands and appreciates, and to frame things in a way that are not technical but more risk oriented is critical. And so that's an area that I think is very much lacking, is effective communication skills, both verbally and in writing. And so I think that's one area. The other area that I've seen, and my program is evolving over time, but I think you'll appreciate this, Heather, is that we're seeing more and more go by way of data services. And so, we have vendors out there, whether it's correct or misleading, claiming that the latest technology uses AI, machine learning,
All the buzzwords.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you ask them, well, is that supervised or unsupervised machine learning? And what's the difference between machine learning and AI? Kind of crickets, but that's a different podcast. But I will say, the ability to think critically along those lines and to start developing those data analytic skills, I think it's going to become more and more important. From my perspective, within any organization, regardless whether it's public, private sector, we're really in this information age, and data, in my opinion, is the lowest common denominator when it comes to organizations making a decision. So whether we're talking about application development, enterprise infrastructure, or information security, data is kind of that lowest common thread, if you will. And people who understand data, understand how it needs to be collected, how it's leveraged, and understands that, I think are going to be better off, whether they're trying to pursue information security or any other sort of field for that matter. And so those are the two areas I think that are lacking overall, and that people need to focus on.
I like that. I think that one thing I always say is that as we move forward, I call it the digital age. As we're moving forward in the digital age, that more and more people need to have critical thinking skills. And I think that you hit that point with data and data analytics and being able to think critically through a problem. So okay, if somebody's if a vendor's telling you, we use the latest AI in this. Well, okay, well, what does that mean? Let's dig into this a little bit deeper here, and let's start breaking this apart a little bit. And I think that goes along with what I'm always talking about is we got to have this critical thinking skills. And all right, let's put this together logically. How does this actually work? Does it is this just a buzzword, or is this really truly what's happening here? So
well, and not to get too far off topic, but that comment reminds me of organization who will remain nameless that invested in a bunch of visualization technology. And I just started laughing, and I'm like, we don't even know enough about the basics to ask the right questions. And as far as I could tell, we're visualizing all the wrong stuff. It looks great on the screen,
Yeah.
but what
Yep.
business problem are we solving, right? And so I think that's an area that's really lacking. And as technologists like you and I think we have a propensity to want to just look for the shiny thing, as opposed to understanding what it is that we're trying to solve, and not try to jump to dessert before we eat our vegetables, so to
Right.
speak. And so I think the vendor ecosystem hasn't helped along those lines either. But
Yeah, and you've hit a couple times today about how solving business problems and making sure that what is the problem we're trying to solve, right? Like it can't just be, sometimes as technologists we're like, oh, this is a really cool thing, or this is a really cool shiny blinky object or whatever, but it really has to come back down to the business. And I really think that more and more people on the technology side, it doesn't matter what area of tech you're in, need to understand that you're there to help enable the business and to solve your customers' problems, to make money, that kind of thing, and making sure that you remember that when you're if you're going to propose a shiny blinky object to your organization, is what business problem is it really truly solving? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about attracting cybersecurity professionals to the field. And I know both you and I probably have had some of the same experiences with given limited resources and trying to hire and retain and attract some of the best talent out there. But what are some of your suggestions or strategies that you've used in the past to try to attract cybersecurity professionals to your team, but then also once they're on your team, what kinds of things do you do to retain them?
yeah, and so for sake of full transparency here, that's an ongoing challenge right now for me. And so, unfortunately, as a government agency, we're fighting preconceived notions, and unfortunately, some of them being true, right? Which is government tends to pay poorly. That's true, and so I'm experiencing that right now. But I think one of the other notions out there that's not necessarily so accurate in this instance is the government is always dealing with old technology or behind the curve. And so I think there's some truth to that. But so that's something that we're trying to fight against. And we're trying to demonstrate that in our case, working for Maricopa County, it's a learning experience. We're using the latest technology, which we definitely are. So we're very fortunate along those lines. But in my instance, one of the things that I try to do to get people just to look at us as an organization and as a potential employer is what our mission is. And so things that I have said on multiple occasions is, one of the things that one of the big reasons why I've stayed in public sector my entire professional career up to this point is been the fact that I like working for an organization who's not necessarily driven by the bottom line, if you will. Okay. And so, not to suggest that we don't care about money, rather quite the opposite. We try to be good keepers of taxpayer dollars, honestly. But with that being said, we're not motivated necessarily by making a profit. We're motivated by delivering a service to our constituents, our residents in the business community, in this instance of Maricopa County. And so there's a certain mission associated with that. And so I love it when we bring on people who have a deep ingrained sense of community service. And those are the kind of people that we try to attract, right? And so once we can get them in the door and once we can get them to accept our salary, then from an ongoing perspective, I try to create as comfortable an environment and as an engaging environment for our current employees as possible. And so I'll do things to the effect of trying to empower them as much as I can within the position that they have within the organization to make decisions, to help provide direction. Also, I try, and I make a very distinct point of this, not that I'm always successful, but I try to make an effort to help my staff understand where they fit in the bigger information security program approach. So we have a program strategy. It's updated multiple times a year. It's shared with all the departments in Maricopa County, so everybody knows exactly what it is that we're trying to do, but more importantly, why we're trying to do it on behalf of the enterprise. But then with my team, I'll tie that directly in there if necessary and just say, the things that you're working on, this is how it's moving the needle on behalf of the enterprise as a whole. Because of you, we're able to do this, this, or this, right? And so I really try to create that environment so they feel like they're adding to the whole, if you will. You know, research has shown that while money obviously is important, it's not necessarily the top motivating factor as to why or why people leave an organization or why they stay with one. I think the research I've seen that makes the most sense to me is you have to meet that minimum pay and, you know, compensation, if you will, for that person to be comfortable. But once you've hit that threshold, what is it that you do to keep them there? So, and then the last thing I try to do to get people to just look at us is be active in the community. And so not only, you know, in terms of the conferences that you and I attend, Heather, but even some of the local meetups and just being accessible and letting people ask me questions about the organization and, you know, me talk up how awesome my team is and working for the county is. And even the 2020 election, like we just got done talking about. I mean, on one hand, it's indescribable the kind of things that we had to contend with, but at the same time, I think me and my team feel a certain amount of pride, regardless of what other people or groups might think, that we had an active hand in protecting democracy. You know, and so that experience unto itself, I think me and my team would take a lot of pride. Knowing that we've done our best along those lines. And so those are kind of ways that I try to sell the organization and sell being part of the team.
Yeah, I think that you hit it spot on the head. You know, my experience being in academia and some of the same things hold true there, that you can't always pay well. And, you know, so you've got to have other benefits for your staff, right? And so I recently wrote a blog article about how to attract and retain cybersecurity professionals to the federal government. And I found a research study that basically just said everything that you said. And I also included it in my blog article, is that, you know, people are attracted to a mission. They want to feel like they're part of a bigger picture. You know, they want to solve complex problems. But I also like your idea, how you said, you make sure everybody knows how they fit in the picture, like how, you know, here's the big picture and here's your piece to how you're helping to solve some of these big complex problems and how you're helping to contribute to the mission. So I really like that. So we're in closing here. So is there any other things that you'd like to add or share to our listeners that you feel may be beneficial for them? We have a lot of people, ranging from people who are just getting interested and getting started in information security, all the way up to CISOs and, you know, government leaders and people who are, you know that there's some pretty big significant issues around us right now within cybersecurity, and they're trying to help figure out ways to solve it. So anywhere in between there, what little final pieces of advice might you have for our listeners?
Yeah, so while this comment might be more applicable, honestly, in my experience, having been in higher ed and local government, I think the comment is applicable across the board. I would encourage organizations and leaders like myself to maintain an open mind when it comes to the credentialing and, you know, not necessarily having to hire somebody with, you know, a bachelor's of science in computer science or MS in technology. There's lots of different skills that are needed across the cybersecurity spectrum. You know, we need good PMs, we need good data analysts, we need good communicators, we need good writers, you know, to really affect and promote the mission, so to speak. So I know, speaking from personal experience, higher ed and government both tend to pay the worst and have the highest expectation when it comes to technical requirements, if you will. I think we need to loosen those up to bring in, to be able to bring in and attract and retain the right people. And so that's definitely one thing. And then the other, and I've been on both the IT management side and the security side. And I can say that it seems like the cybersecurity community is a lot more open and collaborative. I would just say we need to continue to have more of that. Maricopa County right now is actively looking at establishing some formal partnerships for intelligence sharing and preparation for ongoing threats, but in particular the 2022 election cycle, right? And so I think we're going to see more and more of that, and we need to see more and more of that collaboration, both in an informal fashion as well as formal, tangible ways that will improve and impact our collective security for our organizations. So those are just two things that come to mind.
Okay, great. Yes, I think that we talked about a lot of really interesting stuff today. I feel like any one of these topics we could have done an entire podcast on, our whole podcast series on. So I hope our listeners found at least one little nugget of knowledge that will help them in their daily lives. And so thank you, Lester, for joining us on the Offensive Security Podcast. I know that our listeners really will enjoy learning from your experiences. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us today. And you can listen to previous and future Offensive Security Podcasts anywhere you like to download your podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.